So here we are in Microsoft Flight Simulator again, this time at Archangel Talagi Airport in Russia, which if you're interested in visiting this place, the ICAO code for it is Uniform Lima Alpha Alpha. And the reason that we're in Russia this time is because we're looking at a reasonably new release for Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is the aeroplane that you can see in front of you, which is the Yakovlev 18T. And this is from prolific flight sim add-on developer Nemeth Designs. Now, if you aren't familiar with Nemeth Designs, they've been going for years. They've made tons of add-on aircraft for FSX, FS2004, P3D, but this is their first stab at making something for the new Microsoft Flight Simulator. Now, historically, Nemeth Designs have usually made helicopters and usually military helicopters, so this is a bit of a departure for them to be doing a fixed-wing aeroplane, but they've made a lot of Russian stuff in the past and a lot of Russian military stuff, so, you know, they've got like a lot of experience in the sort of area that this plane is. Now, I'll put a link in the description below to the Nemeth Designs website where you can buy this thing, but I think it is now available on the Microsoft Flight Simulator built-in marketplace. But I bought this from the Nemeth Designs website and I paid, I think, £14.65 in UK currency. That's sterling, so equivalent prices in dollars, euros, etc. I'm sure you can work it out from that, but it's a very inexpensive add-on. But is it worth it? Well, we'll find out. Now, this thing's been out about 3 weeks, but when it first came out, it had fairly terrible frame rates, and I was pretty certain that Nemeth had probably forgot to optimize something or maybe uploaded the wrong version to the servers and what have you. So I deliberately held off on reviewing it for a while, but it wasn't long before they patched it to another version that sorted it out, and it now gets good frame rates. So it was worth me hanging on to do the review. And it's been like that for a couple of weeks, so don't worry. If you've seen reviews saying this doesn't get good frame rates, it does now, and I'm using that patched version. So, Nemeth Designs Yakovlev Yak 18T, £14.65. And for that, you get a ton of interesting paint jobs, some military ones, some sort of Russian era, Soviet era type paint jobs, and then some flashy aerobatic paint jobs for the thing. So you get loads of paint jobs with it. You get the Yakovlev 18T, and you also get a PDF manual, but it's short but perfectly formed. I think it's only about 2 pages, but it does tell you everything you need to know about being able to fly this plane, including telling you what all the gauges do and stuff like that. So, so kind of cool. So you can see that this is a very, very pretty aeroplane, and a little bit about the real thing. So, the Yakovlev Design Bureau was founded in the early 1930s in the Soviet Union, but Yakovlev, the designer the bureau was named after, was already designing aeroplanes in 1927 when he was still sort of studying aerodynamics, and he was a very gifted designer and what have you, so they ended up with a Yakovlev Design Bureau. And in the 1930s, Yakovlev were making racing monoplanes and stuff like that. Very, very impressive stuff. But then along came the Second World War, or as the Russians called it, the Great Patriotic War, when in 1941 the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. Now, that's when Yakovlev switched to making military aeroplanes and made some very, very impressive ones. The most famous ones of which would have been the Yak 1, 3, and Yak 9 series of monoplane fighters, which were interesting. They were very, very good fighter aeroplanes, but they were made out of non-strategic materials, so there was a lot of wood involved in them. But if you know anything about wooden aeroplanes in World War II, you'll know that some of them were light and very fast, including the de Havilland Mosquito. So Yak was a very, very good aircraft manufacturer that made some really, really cool aeroplanes. And the Yak 9 was so good, in fact, that Luftwaffe pilots who were flying the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 were actually advised not to engage Yak fighters if they were the type with the little air intake under the nose, because the Germans knew that those things were incredibly maneuverable and fast below about 15,000 feet, which is where a lot of the battles took place. So Yakovlev, a really, really impressive design bureau. And after the Great Patriotic War ended, Yakovlev were instrumental in making some of the first jet fighters for the Soviet Air Force. But they also made a load of different stuff as well, made agricultural aircraft, airliners. You probably know the Yak-40 and the Yak-42, important regional airliners in the Soviet era. They also made jet fighters and jet bombers for the Russian Air Force and the Russian Navy, including the Yakovlev 38 Forger, which is the sort of Russian Navy's equivalent of or at least was at the time, the Russian Navy's equivalent of the Harrier jump jet, in that it was able to take off, and it was a strike aircraft. It wasn't quite as versatile or as sort of technically advanced as the Harrier, but it was a vertical takeoff fighter that could operate from small Navy ships and what have you, which gives you an indication of all the kind of advanced stuff that Yakovlev have built. Now, Yakovlev eventually, in recent years, has been, like a lot of aircraft companies, has been swallowed up into a larger conglomerate of aircraft manufacturers, but it does still live on in spirit. So very impressive aircraft design company, not least of which for the aeroplane that you see in front of you, which is the, as we know, the Yak-18T. Now, stuff about this. There is another Yak-18. There's the Yak-18T, which is the one that you see in front of you, but there is also the Yak-18, and there's a bit of confusion over this. Some people think that the Yak-18, they think the Yak-18T is a variant of the Yak-18, but it's not. The Yak-18, if you see that, is a tail dragger, tandem seat, looks like a sort of fighter bomber from sort of World War II or something like that. And it was used as a combat aircraft in the Korean War. It was used as a strike airplane, and it was quite successful in that role. But the Yak-18T, is not, as some people think, a development of that airplane. It shares the 18 designation, but this was specifically designed from the ground up. Now, what it was designed for was there was a very specific requirement for the design of this thing. What the Russians wanted was they wanted an aeroplane that was relatively easy to fly for new pilots, so it could be used for ab initio training, but they also wanted it to be capable of being used to train instrument flying for the IFR rating that pilots would get. But they also wanted it to have aerobatic capability, because what they wanted to use it for was training Air Force pilots from the ground up to sort of advanced point where they were going to be onto jet trainers and stuff like that. But they also wanted an aeroplane that they could use to train Aeroflot pilots for flying civilian airliners. But they also wanted it to be aerobatic, so that it could teach combat pilots aerobatics. And obviously, you know, if you teach people aerobatics, it gives them a lot of confidence and skill on the controls. But they also wanted it to be a four-seater, so that it could be used for another number of other roles, not least of which was when they were training pilots, they could have an instructor in one seat, a student pilot in the other seat, and then sat behind them, they could have two other student pilots. So when they were doing flying training, the guys that were sat behind could also benefit from the lessons, and then they could land and switch places and stuff like that. So, you know, it made training a very sort of very useful way to go about it. But they also wanted it to be an aircraft that could be used for military liaison and reconnaissance, so the thing can be flown with the doors removed, so you can have parachutists jump out of it, and you can actually jettison the doors off the real thing in flight. So it's an incredibly versatile airplane. It's got a reasonably good range. It can be used for instrument flying, it can be used for basic training, and it can be used for aerobatics. So it's a kind of fun thing to have in your virtual hangar in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So without further ado, let's check this thing out. Now, on the exterior, you can see that it is a very pretty model, as you would expect from a developer that has been making add-on airplanes for a long time. And the Yak-18T is a very, very pretty airplane. It's sort of reminiscent of 30s GA planes from the United States, things like the sort of Spartan Executive and stuff like that. It's got a kind of look to that. Now, the real thing was designed by the Yakovlev Bureau, and its first flight was in 1967. And they produced it for a long time. They've produced hundreds of these things. I think there were about 800 of the things built in total, and it was also built in other countries of the Soviet Union and all this kind of stuff. And another company did a sort of updated version of it, where they sort of squared off the tailplane a little bit to make it look a little bit more modern and put a one-piece windscreen in it and glass avionics in the cockpit and all that kind of stuff. And that is the Techno Avia SM94, which technically you could still buy one of those if you wanted to. So you could buy a new one of these. But the Yak 18T, after the fall of the Soviet Union and when the Berlin Wall came down and it was all glasnost and perestroika, a lot of Soviet Air Force and Aeroflot training Yak 18s became available for sale, and what a lot of companies were doing was refurbishing them and selling them to the West. At the time, this is the early 90s, at the time you could buy one of these refurbished for about 12 grand. You can't do that now. You'd probably pay about 70 grand for a refurbished one, which is, still quite cheap for a fully aerobatic aeroplane that's a four-seater with a good load carrying capability. So, an impressive plane. So you do find a lot of these in the West, in the United States and what have you, because they're popular with GA flyers who want something that's a little bit different with a lot of capability. So, as I say, first flight 1967, lots of them produced. It has the engine on it is Vedeniev 9-cylinder M14P, so that's a radial engine. And that is, there are two versions of that. There's the one that's modelled in this, which is the 360 horsepower variant, but there is also a 400 horsepower variant of it. So if you see one of these getting chucked about at air shows and you think, wow, that can shift a bit and it's got a good power to weight ratio, bear in mind that it could possibly be the 400 horsepower version of the Vedeniev M14P that's fitted in the thing. Now, that power enables it to sort of be chucked about quite a bit, and this thing will climb at about 960 feet per minute, up to 13,000 feet, and it'll whiz along at about 160, maybe 165 miles per hour, and it's got a range of about 460 miles, so it's not got a massive range, but it's not bad as a touring aeroplane. And it also has a bit of rough field capability as well. I mean, I wouldn't want to land it on really rough fields, but it was designed to operate off grass airfields, so that's kind of cool as well. So very, very capable. The only thing to sort of watch out for is that it is sort of like a little bit bigger and heavier because it's strong, it's stressed for aerobatics and what have you than most GA aeroplanes. So it has got a higher stall speed than your average GA aeroplane. It'll stall at about 70. So it comes in a little bit faster than some GA aeroplanes, but that's because it's such a versatile aeroplane. I mean, it is stressed for plus 6.5 G and minus 3.2 G, so you can really chuck this thing about. And it's very, very strong. And the other thing that's good about it is because it's got a 360 horsepower engine, the real thing, you'll bulk it out before you ever max it out on weight. So if you're looking for a reason to use this in your flight simulator, it's quite useful in things like air hauler, because it's got quite a good lifting capability. There's quite a lot of room in the thing, so it's good fun for a lot of reasons. Good GA tourer, you can use it for IFR navigation, and you can throw it about and do a bit of aerobatics on the thing. So as we can see, that it's a very, very nice model, and if we have a bit of a close inspection of that, if we have a look, you can see the level of detail on this. So we've got good riveting with sort of a bit of dirt round there and all this kind of stuff, and there's loads of really cool paint jobs that you get with this thing, sort of combat military paint jobs and austere Soviet era paint jobs, and these more sort of dramatic aerobatic paint jobs with all the checkerboard paint schemes and all that kind of stuff. So it's very cool. There'll certainly be a paint job that you like on this thing, and as I say, I'll put a link in the description below to the Nemeth Designs website where you can see a load of screenshots of all the different paint jobs you get with this thing. Now while we're on this view, so you can see good detail. If you look at the leading edge of the propeller blade, it's got all the little segments on the leading edge with the fittings and stuff like that. But while we're on this view, that red thing behind the propeller, it's tempting to think that what that is that's an engine cover, but it's not. This is common on quite a few Soviet era propeller planes. What that actually is that's the cooling gills. And if we go onto the interior view and I flip the cooling gills open, like that, and then we go back on the external view. You can see there that the Vedeniev M14P engine is fully modelled on the inside and quite nice, and the cowling gills are open to reveal that. So a very, very nice model on the outside, and also a very, very nice model on the inside as well, as we shall see now. So we'll take a look on the inside now. If you see images on the internet or on YouTube of people that have bought these things and are using them in the West as sort of touring planes and what have you, very often they'll have refurbished interiors with nice leather seating and stuff like this. But this thing is depicted as it would have been when it was being used as a Soviet Union era training aeroplane for Air Force pilots and Aeroflot pilots and stuff like that. So it's got a very sort of austere Russian look about it. You can tell that from the seating. Anyone who's ever had an old Russian car will certainly recognize the look of this with the headlining and stuff like that. And it's a bit sort of careworn looking, which is kind of cool. About the only bad thing about this is that you can't open the doors and you can't remove the doors, which you can in on the real thing. You can jettison the doors on the real thing in flight, and you can fly it with the doors off, so you can have parachutists jumping out of it, or you can have someone with a camera shooting out of the windows and stuff like that. So it's a bit of a shame that the doors don't open and can't be jettisoned, but you know, apart from that, that's about the only thing that doesn't work in this cockpit. There is one other thing that doesn't work though, and that is the you can see these little red handles down by the side of the seat on both sides. What they do is they adjust the height of the seat and they adjust its forward and backwards movement, because the rudder pedals don't have much travel in the real thing. But you know, that's not a problem for us, because we can do this and move the camera viewpoint backwards and forwards, so we don't have to worry about that. All the really important stuff does work. So let's have a look at what works in the cockpit. I'll start with the pedestal. We've already seen the cowling gills are there, and they work perfectly fine. And then if we come down here, we've got a flap lever. The Yakovlev Yak 18T has split flaps like you find on a DC-3 or a Spitfire, i.e. only the bottom half of the wing separates to come down as a flap. So it doesn't increase the wing area, and it doesn't really increase the camber of the wing. What it does is it acts more in increasing the lift a little bit, but increasing the drag a lot. So good draggy flaps for short field landing, but you know, not the best for short takeoffs. But they do function. They function more off Newton's third law of motion than the Bernoulli effect, if you're curious as to how split flaps work. Flaps there. We'll see them when we can take this for a flight. So what we've got there is carburetor heating. Notice that most of these controls do have tooltips in English, so don't worry about it being a Rusky aeroplane, because the tooltips are mostly helpful. So we've got carburetor heating, which is off at the moment. We've got a propeller pitch lock there. Fairly obvious what that does. We've got a throttle lever there. We've got a propeller pitch lever here. Now notice that when we crank this thing up, the propeller pitch is set at -25, which might lead you to think that you could use that to sort of usefully brake the prop like beta mode for a landing. But notice that what happens is when I put the pitch forward into positive and then try and pull it back into negative, it's probably not going to let me get it back into that minus mode there. I don't know whether you'd be able to tweak that on your throttle settings to be able to get it back into sort of beta mode, but you know, I suppose it's something that you could play around with. I'm going to get the propeller pitch forward because obviously we want to fly this thing in a little while, and we don't want to forget to have the propeller pitch fully forward for landing. Obviously you pull it back for cruise. So there we go. That's the propeller pitch. And then what we've got is we've got the oil cooler, because with this thing having a radial air-cooled engine, obviously you've got to watch the instruments and the gauges to make sure that the engine stays cool. And how you will do that is with obviously the throttle and then the cowl flaps and the oil cooler there. So we can put the oil cooler on if we want to. So that's the rear part of the center pedestal. And then moving to the front part of the center pedestal, pretty simple. Notice that we've got a few VNEs and things like that on there, 162 knots VNE and all this kind of stuff, and you know, flat landing speeds and all that kind of stuff, and vertical speed and weight limits. So that's kind of useful, and it's not useful that it's in English. Then what we've got is the fuel for the left and right on there. We've got the cockpit lights, which I will turn on because you want to see the lighting in a minute or two. And then we've got this, which selects the ADF receiver for either the left or the right hand side. And oh, spelling mistake there. I before E, except after C. So anyway, so that's the central pedestal. Now let's have a look while we're down here at these switches here and these controls here. So over on the right hand side, you've got a switch for the pneumatic system. More on that in a minute. Some of the things like the flaps and the brakes work off pneumatics on this, like they do on a lot of Russian aeroplanes and some World War II fighters. So we'll have that turned on. This is the emergency gear extension for if the pneumatics fail. To the left of that, we can see a bunch of guarded switches. Most of these are fairly self-explanatory, apart from one, which we'll get to in a minute. So we can see there that what we've got is the clock heat on, and then what we've got is we've got the pitot heat, and the strobe lights, we'll get those on, and the position lights, we'll get those on, and the panel lights, we'll have those on, stall warning on, attitude indicator on, magnetic compass on. This is the one that's strange. You might not know what that is. PT200 on. I'll explain what that is in a minute. And then last but not least, the taxi lights on. The PT200, lots of Russian airplanes have sort of weird electrical systems on them, and especially Yakovlev airplanes, whereby there can be several different voltages for the various instruments and stuff like that. For example, the Yak 42 little regional airliner has 3 different voltage systems for all the instruments and what have you. And so what you need is some sort of like transformer or inverter to be able to provide lots of those different voltages, and that's what the PT200 does. So just switch it on and all your instruments will work fine. Carrying across, and we'll stay low on here, we'll go across the top of the instrument panel in a minute. Unfortunately, like a lot of GA aeroplanes for flight simulators, normally what you can do is you can sort of click in this area here and hide the yoke, but you can't do that on this thing. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to move the yoke out of the way. And one thing that isn't accurate on this is that there isn't much forward and backwards yoke travel replicated on this. It moves a lot more backwards and forwards on the real aeroplane. So we want to see things like that. We are going to have to kind of tilt things out of the way, but you can see that there are some, if I pull back the view a little bit, and I can kind of move the view down a little bit. You can see that there are sort of English enunciations for things on here. So let's have a look at these things. So fuel valve open, obviously we want that. And then what we've got is the transponder is switched on, and the fuel indicator is switched on, and the marker is switched on, and the intercoms are on, and the ADF is on, and the VOR is on, and the PO250 is on. That's that thing there, the sort of old school Soviet era radio. And then what we've got is the engine instruments on, and the landing gear lamps are on, and the ignition is on. But nothing is lit up because we haven't got the generator, aka the alternator, the engine driven generator on. Still not lighting up because we haven't yet put the battery on, and now stuff lights up. To the left of that there is a gear lever with up, down and neutral, and there is a little lock on there, but you can just hit your G key on the keyboards and that will do it. There is a trim lever for the elevator, trim wheel I should say, and we can put a bit of positive trim on this thing. The Yakovlev 18T has a very, very sensitive elevator. It has very, very sensitive controls overall because it's intended for aerobatics and stuff like that. So you need a bit of a deft touch on the controls, but it's not that hard to fly, as we'll see. I'm pretty sure that on the real thing would be the sort of release lever for removing the doors and what have you. I wouldn't swear to that, but I think that's what it is. So anyway, let's go across the panel and have a look at things. So up at the top, we'll start at the top up here. So we've got an oil dilution switch there. What that will do is in the Soviet Union, you get very cold weather. So sometimes what you'll want is diluted oil so that the oil isn't all gloopy when the engine starts. So you want to get oil on the moving parts quickly, so you would turn that thing on when you're starting. The engine start lever is automatically depressed, so it will start when we flick the magnetos on. We've got this thing here, this gauge here. Now, what that is, I'm just going to move the view back up a little bit so that we're not getting kind of reflections on the gauges. So this gauge here is kind of important. You see this on a lot of Russian airplanes and a lot of World War II fighters. What it is a gauge for the pneumatic air system, and that's engine driven. So what happens is you rev the engine up, it develops pneumatic power in a little pneumatic tank, and then that is used to power things like lowering the flaps and operating the wheel brakes and stuff like that. And the reason that there's a gauge there is if you're doing lots of braking, taxiing out to the runway, you can run out of pneumatic air. So you keep an eye on that gauge to make sure that you've got some air. Otherwise, when you go to use the brakes, you might be surprised to find that you haven't got any brakes. And you can hear that on the real thing. You hear it on the Antonov AN2 as well. That has a pneumatic braking system and pneumatic flap system. And you hear on the real things a kind of air dump noise. When you use it, it makes a sort of type noise, which this thing doesn't do. It would be helpful if they added that, because it would be more like the real thing. When you lower the flaps on the real thing, or you use the brakes, it makes this very obvious type air brake noise. But that's what the vacuum gauge is for. To the right of that, there is an accelerometer, otherwise known as a G meter. This thing is stressed for plus 6.5 G, minus 3.2 G, so you can chuck this thing about. However, what I would recommend you do is, it can be quite sensitive to if you've got the option for aircraft stresses to cause damage to the aeroplane. So if you really want to throw this thing about and you don't want it to be braking and ending your flight, I would go in the options and I would turn the stress to causes damage to the aeroplane off, because you'll probably be able to have a little bit more fun with the thing with that turned off. So directly below the accelerometer there is this thing, which is the primer. But it's not like primers on a lot of aeroplanes. It has two settings on it. You can prime the cylinders and you can prime the inlet manifold on the thing, because obviously you have to start this thing in cold weather. So what you can do is you can turn this thing and prime the cylinders, or you can turn it the other way and you can prime the manifold like that to help it get started in cold weather, and then you can put it back in the middle for off. Directly below that there are two stall warning lights. One of them is warning that you are approaching the stall, and the other one lights up when you actually have stalled. That's so that you can use it in combination with the G meter and the airspeed indicator to time your stall turns and things like that, because obviously, you know, if you want to do stalls and tail sludge, you want to be applying control inputs and power settings at the exact point of the stall. So you would want that light, and you will want that light as well. Obviously on the real thing you get feedback through the yoke from buffeting from the elevators, but that's kind of useful, and they do work well if you want to throw this thing about. Now what we've got here is we've got a panel here with six warning lights for things like you're overstressing the engine and things like that, and you know it's overheating and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of them, and they are listed on the PDF manual that you get with this thing, so that's good. I have absolutely no idea what this switch does on the real thing, but it doesn't function in the sim anyway, so I'm not going to worry about it too much. Directly above that you can see that there's the magnetos, which we're going to be using in a minute to start this thing. Below that you can see an outside air temperature gauge, and to the right of that you can see the controls for the intercom on the thing, which do sort of function. You can see there that I'm getting tooltips when I go over these things. To the left of that you've got your funky Soviet era radio and radio navigation system, but you don't need to worry about using that, because you've got this thing here as well, which is more sort of traditional radios. There are two warning lights there, one for the landing gear and one for the marker, like that. So that's that section of the panel. So let's get the thing started before we continue across the panel. So here we go. I'm just going to check down here. I've got cowl flaps open, I've got the throttle cracked open a little bit, I've got the propeller pitch fully forward, the oil coolers on, that's all good. I've got everything switched on, the electrics are on, so when I roll this it should start the engine. Are you gonna do it? There we go. So I have started the engine, but you can hear that the sort of sounds pretty quiet on there. So let's crack the throttle opener a little bit more, and we'll make sure the fuel valve's on and all that's good and what have you, and we'll prime the cylinders, we'll prime the manifold, and we'll give it another go. There we go. Yeah, that was me turning the Magneto the wrong way. Easily done when you're looking at Rusky controls, although that control is in English, so it was more me being a numpty than anything else. Now, so you can hear the engine, what I'll do is I'll rev it up a little bit. So it gets this kind of type noise when it revs up, and you'll note that the brakes are holding it. If we go on the external view, you get sort of like 3D sound off the thing. I won't have it too loud. But you can see that the parking brakes aren't exactly holding the thing, so you know, pretty powerful engine. Anyway, back in the cockpit, there, that's not too loud. We can still hear what's going on. So I'll just keep that ticking over a little bit. Now then, more gauges on the thing. Yeah, you've got ADF gauge and OBS gauge for the VOR and ADF navigation up there. Those two things. You've got standard radio with comms radio, and then the navigation stuff down there for ADF and what have you. Back up here, artificial horizon with turn and slip ball below that. Vertical speed indicator. This is a vacuum gauge. Some of the instruments on this airplane, as I said, you know, it's got weird voltages and all that lot. Some of them are vacuum-driven instruments, as they are on most sort of Western GA planes as well. So you'll notice that when I throttle up, this gauge will move. We're getting a little bit more engine-driven vacuum power. You'll notice the RPM gauge starts going as well. So carrying across, we've got a chronometer. We've got this thing, which is a combined volt and ammeter. We've got this thing, which is an inclinometer. We've got the RPM gauge. There, we've got a combination gauge with all the oil pressure and oil temperature. We've got an altimeter there. We've got an airspeed indicator with two different calibrations on it for knots and kilometers per hour. We've got the carburetor temperature, which obviously you want to keep in the green. And then what we've got is we've got the cylinder head temperature, which you also want to keep in green. So you're going to be doing that if these things start overheating, by playing with the cowl flaps and the oil cooler on there. So carburetor, cylinder head, fuel gauge on there. Note that what I have got, I'll just show you here, I've got 50% fuel, but notice that this is not a linear gauge. Yeah, it's not going to sit there in the middle of the track at 50% fuel, because the full contents are 200 and we've got half fuel, so it's reading 100. So don't let this catch you out. If your fuel gauge is there, you've not got half tanks, you've got about third tanks, like that. Transponder, if you want to fly this on VATSIM. I'll move the yoke a little bit and turn it. We've got that, which is the co-pilot side intercom control. Now, we are at Archangel, Talagi Airport, which is sort of northwestern Russia, up near the Arctic Circle, where you get quite swift magnetic variation changes and stuff like that. So what this gauge is here, which is something that you see on Russian airplanes a lot, is a magnetic deviation indicator, like that. And it has got in the manual how you use those things. So if you're not familiar with that, that's what that is. Now, other things that we've got a whiskey compass, which works. We've got these little sunscreens that work. Over on the right hand side, on the Yak 18T, you can see that what this is this little vent window. Quite common on Russian aeroplanes to have vents and fans in the cockpit and stuff like that, because some parts of the Soviet Union, despite the cliche, are very, very warm. Some parts are really cold, some parts are very, very warm because it's a vast area, Russia or Soviet Union as it was. So we've got this. Now, neither of them open, but it doesn't really matter, because not all Yakovlev Yak 18Ts actually have that vent on it. If you look at some pictures of them, you'll see that some of them don't actually have that. And the Techno Avia SM94, which is the updated version of it, doesn't have that at all either, because it has a one-piece curved windscreen. So there are a couple of things that aren't working in this cockpit, but the vast majority of it and all of the fun stuff actually is working. So you know, pretty good and quite realistic. So let's take this thing for a bit of a fly. The other thing, you can't hide the yokes. On the yokes, this thing here, this little lever, is the parking brake, which you can release or you can put on. I'm pretty sure on the real thing, how that works is when you get your fingers around this part of the yoke and you pull that lever back, I think you press a button on the yoke and that locks it in position. But if you don't press that button, then you use it as a sort of on-off brake. I think that's how it works. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure how that is how it works. Right, so I'll get my feet on my rudder pedals, and just before we go, what I will do is I'll point something out to you, which is why you have to be a little bit careful about taxiing this thing. So if you look on the external view, it is a tricycle landing gear. However, the tricycle landing gear is quite tall, which means that, you know, the weight is quite high on the thing. And if you look at it, there is a lot of fuselage behind the wheels, so there's a fair bit of weight behind the wheels, and it's a quite short trail on the landing gear. If you look at that, you can see that that's quite a sort of tight triangle there, you know, with not a lot of trail distance between the nose gear and the landing gear. And what that means is that if you taxi this really fast and throw a lot of rudder on, it's got a very, very sensitive rudder, and what you could do is you could pitch it over onto its wing. So you've got to be a little bit careful about how you taxi this thing. We'll get the flaps down. So there's one stage of flaps, two stage of flaps, three stage of flaps, and that's your lot. Similar to a Spitfire or a DC-3, split flaps like that. Lots of drag and a little bit of lift, and working more off Newton's third law of motion than the Bernoulli principle, i.e. every force there is an opposite and equal reaction, so it forces air down, which forces the aeroplane up. Good for a bit of drag when it's coming in for a landing. Anyway, we've got one stage of flaps on there, so let's get this thing taxiing. I'll put it on a fun view where we can see stuff going on, and we'll go on the cockpit view and we'll get this thing going. So we're releasing the parking brake, we'll give it a little bit of power like that, we'll go there, and I'm just being careful not to really pitch this thing, because I don't want it going over on its wingtip. You know, it's not desperately bad, but, you know, it's just something to be aware of. So this is Archangel, Uniform Lima Alpha Alpha, if you want the ICAO code for it, Talagi Airport, which the Russians used to fly MiG-31s and MiG-25s from, and it can get quite snowy here as well in the winter. So the real thing has a grooved and segmented runway, so that it could be used for operations on things like the MiG-25, which have very fast takeoff and landing speeds and stuff like that, because it's a like Mach 3 interceptor. So it's quite a long runway. So I don't think we really need to worry about whether we've got flaps on or off at the moment. Now, this thing does not require a lot of rudder to keep it straight. I'll put it on this view when we take off, just so you can see what rudder inputs I'm doing. Just do a quick check of everything. All of the T's and P's seem to be in the green. We've got the oil coolers on. The cowl flaps are open. Prop pitch is fully forward and all that kind of stuff. So let's go. And if you keep an eye on the rudder pedals when I power this thing up, you'll see that I'm not having to give it much rudder. If you do give this thing rudder, don't give it a boot full of rudder, because it does have very, very sensitive tail surface controls, which means that, you know, it would be easy to sort of rock it over onto a wing. And so let's get that thing in here, and we'll give it a bit of nose up trim like that, and then we'll go on the external view to see the gear coming up. So up comes the gear, and up come the flaps. And if you can't get the gear and flaps up, give it some boost on the engine. So here we are off the runway at Talagi. Up ahead of us is the city of Archangel, or Arkhangelsk, if you want to call it that. It's a very historic city and a major port, and you know, quite interesting terrain around it with all this. You can see that the elevator on this is very, very twitchy. And you can see that because we're in line with the runway, I'm getting that thing lighting up, which is the marker. So if you can see that little light going on the dashboard, don't worry, it doesn't mean the wings are about to fall off. So this thing will cruise at about 160, something like that. And I think that's getting pretty near the VNE, which is 162. But it's a big, tough airplane so you could probably take it past its VNE without it falling apart. Not that I'm recommending you do that. And it's got very, very sensitive controls. The real thing is very, very aerobatic. If you look on YouTube, you'll find videos of people chucking these things about. And it's got actually quite a fast roll rate for a GA aeroplane. This thing in the simulator, I think, you know, the roll rate is a little bit slower than it is on the real thing in this. But, you know, by and large, you can chuck this thing about and have a bit of fun with it. There we go. So if we have a look at it in the air, you see this thing. It's quite a pretty aeroplane, and it looks well in the air. There's Talagi from the air. So, quite a nice looking aeroplane. You can see why people bought these things when they started becoming available, because they've got quite a lot of presence on the ramp in amongst a lot of Cessnas and Pipers. You know, if you wanted something different looking, they're pretty cool. As I say, you know, quite useful in the sim because not bad for IFR navigation. Alright, it hasn't got a GPS, but you can sort of cheat and use that thing there. You can see I've put a flight plan in, so you could manually follow the magenta line because you've not got an autopilot, but it does fly quite well hands off. There I am, hands off, clapping my hands, and you can see that it keeps pretty straight. So you can just sort of like cheat and use that as a bit of a GPS if you don't want to use ADF navigation or VORs and all that kind of stuff. And it's fun for that. You can do a few arrows on it, and because it's got a good power to weight ratio and quite a bit of room in it, not a bad aeroplane for air hauler if you want a single engine plane to fly about. Fuel wise, if you're bothered about that in things like air hauler and stuff like that, it is going to use a bit more fuel than a typical Cessna or what have you, because it has got a 360 horsepower engine, but you know, I don't think you need to worry about it too much. And it is also designed to operate off grass runways as well. I mean, you know, it's not exactly a bush plane, but you can get it down on fairly rough airfields if you have to. So let's get to the fun part. Note that it is very, very pitch sensitive. We'll get a bit of power on the thing. Keeping an eye on the airspeed indicator, and then what we'll do is we'll pull it up. And you'll notice that I was able to get really lazy on coming over the top there. Didn't really have to use momentum to get me over in the loop. So got a fair bit of power. There's the roll rate. The real thing will roll a little bit faster than that. It's not a million miles off how the thing rolls, but you know, the real thing would roll a little bit faster than that. A little bit of speed up. So there you go, you can kind of chuck it about a bit if you want to. So yeah, if you like something different in your virtual hangar and you're a fan of Russian aeroplanes, which I am, I think this is a particularly pretty Russian aeroplane, but it's got that kind of brutish interior look to it. Then would I recommend it? Yeah, it's kind of fun. You know, it's inexpensive. It's only less than 15 quid, which is pretty cheap for an add-on payware add-on aeroplane. And you get a lot of paint jobs with it, and it's something novel. It's got slightly different panel on it that you can have a bit of fun with. So yeah, it's kind of fun. So there we are, over the forests near the aerodrome. So yeah, as I say, around here is some interesting terrain to explore, and it gets very snowy around here in winter time. So, you know, kind of fun to have a bit of a look at. And, you know, as I say, don't worry too much about not having the GPS, because you can always cheat like that and go, there we go, like that. So, you know, if you can't find your aerodrome, or you don't know which way to head and you don't want to use that sort of that navigational stuff, then you can always cheat and do it that way. Now, as I say, the real thing, you would need a bit of sort of pneumatic power to get the flaps down. So and it does simulate that. So, you know, if you've had the throttle back for a long time, and then you press the gear lever and the gear doesn't come down or something like that, just give it a bit of power, and then your gear will come down. And so will your flaps. And if you're sort of looking a bit puzzled and going, where's the airspeed indicator? It's that one there. Yeah, you can see I'm just coming out of the green arc there, like that. And the altimeter is just above that. Not that I'm worrying too much about that. Will come in visually on there. So you got nice bright markers for the landing and stuff like that. And of course, if you're a little bit concerned about being out sea other than those, you can always cheat and do that. See if we can just tink it up a little bit. And there we go, and we'll give it some brakes and really slam that thing in for a hole. Like that. So it is possible to sort of pull this up for quite a tight landing, and as I say, it was designed to operate over grass. So you can do that kind of thing as well if you like. We don't care about taxiways. Might be a bit of a bump here. Yeah, not terrible. And that's, I don't know what plane that is there. The main airport is well down that way. They do commercial flights from here. Let's get alongside that thing. And we'll shut the throttle, and we'll get the parking brake on. I happen like that, and I'll hit continue because that's annoying when it does that, and hopefully that will be kind of a cool engine stopping noise, although the propeller animation doesn't stay with that sort of the main crankshaft still rotating sound. If we look on the exterior view, you can see there, compared to that little GA twin that's alongside, that it is quite a big aeroplane. You know, you can see from that guy there how high that sits off the ground. So, even though it's a 4-seater, it is quite a big aeroplane, quite high off the ground. So that's what I was saying about, like watch it in turns and things like that, because you'll pitch it over. But it's fun. Do I recommend it? Well, if you like slightly different stuff and you like Russian stuff, which I do, then yeah, absolutely. But as ever with add-on aeroplanes and what have you, it's kind of shiny and new and stuff like that. But would you really fly it? Well, I certainly would, because I'd find a use for it in air hauler, and I like Russian aeroplanes and all that kind of stuff. So I'd fly it. But as ever with add-on aeroplanes, just bear in mind, would you actually fly it? And do you think it's worth it? So, for less than 15 quid and something that I would genuinely use in air hauler, I kind of recommend it. It's not super duper realistic in terms of how it flies, but it's not a million miles off it, and it's a fun thing to chuck about. And it's something a little bit different from your average Cessna or Piper. So yeah, absolutely. If you like this kind of thing, go get it. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Choc's Hangar. Yakovlev Yak 18T from Nemeth Designs, which is, as I say, now patched, and you can see does get okay frame rates, because you can see I've got like all the trees on and things like that, and what have you. So it's not like I've toned down the graphics or anything like that just to sort of try and get it to get a good frame rate. It is pretty good. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Choc's Hangar. There's another one coming up later this week. So if you like this sort of thing, you like my reviews, and there's loads of them, new ones on at the minute, then hit that subscribe button, and then you'll get notifications of when there's a new video and all this lot, and you can go onto the comments and slag me off and say, you don't know what you're talking about and all this kind of stuff. Or whatever. Because I always like chatting to people, and if you really like chatting, go on places like AvSim and FlightSim.com and what have you, and join in the fun and what have you. Because it's always a good laugh to talk to people about stuff and get into arguments and what have you. And with me being from the UK, if you're from Italy, you can make fun of the fact that Italy thrashed us in the European Cup final the other day. Anyway, take care, everyone. That's it for now. Bye.